The Texas sun hung low and heavy over the outskirts of Dallas, baking the dry earth until it cracked in spiderweb patterns. Inside the small weathered house at the end of Elm Street, Margaret Hayes wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. The air conditioner had given up the ghost 3 years ago, and the ceiling fan spinning lazily above her did little more than stir the warm, stagnant air. At 67 years old, Margaret had learned that heat was just another thing to endure, much like the silence that filled these rooms since her husband Frank passed away a decade ago. Today was different, though. Today was the second Sunday in May, Mother's Day. Margaret moved slowly around her kitchen, a space that smelled of cinnamon and old wood. She was preparing an apple pie, the same recipe she had used for 40 years. Her hands, though gnarled by arthritis, worked the dough with a muscle memory that required no thought. She checked the oven temperature for the third time, making sure it was perfect. She wanted everything to be perfect. Her son David was coming to visit. David was her pride. The boy who used to run through this very kitchen with muddy knees was now a man of importance. A tech mogul who lived in a world of glass high-rises and digital numbers that Margaret could barely comprehend. She saw him rarely now, perhaps once every 2 or 3 months. His life was a whirlwind of meetings and flights, while hers was measured in the slow dripping of the kitchen faucet and the turning of Bible pages at St. Mary's Church. She walked to the window and peered through the lace curtains she had sewn herself. The road outside was empty, just a stretch of gray asphalt shimmering in the heat. Margaret sighed and smoothed down her apron. It was her best apron, the one with the embroidered sunflowers, but she knew it looked faded. Everything in her life was fading. The paint on the walls, the carpet in the hallway, even the light in her own eyes seemed dimmer these days. She opened the refrigerator to retrieve a pitcher of iced tea. The fridge was almost empty save for a half carton of milk, 2 eggs, and a jar of pickles. For the past 8 months, Margaret had been living on a knife's edge. Her pension was small, barely enough to cover the property taxes and the rising cost of electricity. She had been surviving on canned soup and bread packages discreetly left on her porch by the church charity group. She never told David. She could not bear to be a burden to the son she had raised to soar. Just then, the low hum of a powerful engine broke the Sunday silence. Margaret's heart leaped. She hurried to the door, checking her reflection in the hallway mirror. She pinched her pale cheeks, trying to bring some color to them, and forced a smile that she hoped looked effortless. A silver car gleaming like liquid mercury under the sun turned into her gravel driveway. It was a brand new vehicle, sleek and aggressive-looking, completely out of place in this neighborhood of rusting pickup trucks and sensible sedans. The car came to a halt, and the doors opened. David stepped out first. He looked handsome in a way that made Margaret's chest ache with pride, but he also looked tired. His shoulders were slumped beneath his expensive polo shirt, and there were gray shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Then from the passenger side came Clara. If David looked like he was carrying the weight of the world, Clara looked like she owned it. She emerged from the car like a butterfly shaking off a cocoon. She wore a dress of shimmering pearl silk that caught the sunlight and high heels that looked more like sculptures than shoes. Her hair was a cascade of perfect golden waves, and even from the porch Margaret could smell the scent of her perfume. It was Chanel No. 5, a scent that was sharp, expensive, and overpowering. Mom, David called out, walking up the porch steps with a bouquet of white lilies. "Happy Mother's Day." Margaret opened her arms and engulfed him. He felt thinner than she remembered, his body rigid with tension. He hugged her back, but it was brief, a fleeting contact before he pulled away. "Hello, my sweet boy," Margaret said, her voice trembling slightly. "You look wonderful." "And you look as lovely as ever," Mother Clara said, stepping up beside David. Her voice was melodic, sweet like honey but lacking any real warmth. She offered a cheek for a kiss, and Margaret leaned in, careful not to let her old apron brush against the silk dress. Come in," Margaret ushered them inside. "It is not much cooler in here, but at least there is iced tea and pie." They sat at the small, round dining table. The room felt suddenly crowded. Clara placed her designer handbag on the extra chair, wiping the seat with a subtle brush of her hand before sitting down. David loosened his collar, looking around the room with a gaze that seemed both nostalgic and critical. "The house looks good, Mom," David said, taking the glass of iced tea Margaret offered. "A little hot, though. Do you need me to call someone to look at the AC unit?" No, Margaret lied quickly, waving her hand. "I like the warmth. It is good for my joints." Clara took a sip of her tea and set the glass down. She had barely touched it. She looked around the walls, her eyes lingering on the faded wallpaper and the old photographs. "You have kept everything exactly the same," Clara noted, a small smile playing on her lips. "It is so quaint, like a museum." Margaret did not know if it was a compliment or an insult, so she simply smiled. "I find comfort in the familiar." David reached across the table and took Margaret's hand. His palm was warm, but his grip was loose. "Mom, I know we have not been around much lately. Work has been insane. The merger is taking everything I have." "I understand, son," Margaret said, squeezing his hand. "I only want you to be happy and healthy." "I am trying," David sighed. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his next words. Then he asked the question that would change everything. "Mom, I just want to make sure you are comfortable. You are doing okay with the money, right? Clara still sends you the $5,000 every month, does she not?" The room went silent. For Margaret, the world seemed to stop spinning. The ticking of the wall clock roared in her ears like thunder. $5,000. The number echoed in her mind, bouncing off the peeling wallpaper. $5,000 a month. For the past 8 months, she had been skipping meals to save money for blood pressure medication. She had been walking 2 miles to the grocery store because she could not afford the gas for her old sedan. She had been reading by candlelight to save on the electric bill. She looked at David. His face was open, concerned, waiting for confirmation. Then she looked at Clara. Clara was frozen. The smile on her face had not dropped, but it had become rigid like a mask made of porcelain. Her eyes, however, were wide, and they were locked onto Margaret's face with an intensity that was almost predatory. It was a look of warning, a silent, desperate command. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. If she said no, if she told the truth right now, it would shatter David. She could see how fragile he was, how desperately he wanted to believe that he was a good son providing for his mother. If she told him that for 8 months she had received nothing but silence, it might break him. And Clara. Clara was his wife, the woman he had chosen. Exposing her lie now in this small, hot room would start a war. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat. Her mouth felt dry as dust. $5,000, she repeated, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," David nodded. "I transfer it to Clara's account on the 15th of every month, and she handles the rest. She said she brings it to you in cash or a check when she visits because you do not like online banking." Clara shifted in her seat, the silk of her dress rustling like a snake moving through dry leaves. "Oh, David, you know how Mother is," Clara said, her voice pitching slightly higher than usual. "Sometimes she forgets things. Old age, you know. But I am sure she remembers the envelopes." Clara's eyes bore into Margaret's. It was a dare. Margaret looked at her son again. He looked so hopeful. He needed to believe that his mother was taken care of. He needed to believe his wife was dutiful. Margaret made a choice. It was a choice born of a mother's instinct to protect her child even from the truth that would hurt him. She forced a smile. It was the hardest thing she had ever done. "Oh yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Of course. My memory is not what it used to be. The money. Yes. It is a great help, David. Thank you." David exhaled a breath he seemed to have been holding for a long time. His shoulders dropped. "Thank God. I was worried when you said you were just getting by on the phone last week. I wanted to make sure it was enough." "It is more than enough, son," Margaret lied again. "The church helps me too, just for company mostly." Clara let out a tiny, almost inaudible sigh of relief. She reached out and patted Margaret's hand, her manicured nails clicking against the table. "See, David, I told you she was fine. Mother just likes to live simply. She is a Depression-era baby at heart, aren't you, Mother?" "I was born in 1957, Clara," Margaret said, her voice cool. "But yes, I know the value of $1." The rest of the visit passed in a blur. Margaret served the apple pie. David ate 2 slices, praising the flaky crust, while Clara picked at hers, leaving the crust on the plate. They talked about David's company, about their upcoming trip to the Hamptons, about the new car. Every word felt like a stone being placed on Margaret's chest. $5,000 a month. 8 months. That was $40,000. $40,000 that her son had worked for. $40,000 that could have fixed her roof, repaired her car, and filled her refrigerator for years. Where had it gone? Margaret watched Clara as she spoke. She watched the way Clara's diamond earrings caught the light. She watched the way Clara avoided direct eye contact whenever the topic of finances came up. She saw the new purse, the shoes, the dress. The realization settled in Margaret's stomach like cold lead. She was being robbed. And not just robbed of money, but robbed of her son's care. After an hour, David checked his platinum watch. "Mom, we have to get going. We have a dinner reservation in the city at 6. "Of course," Margaret said, standing up. Her legs felt weak. "I understand." "You are busy people." They walked to the door. The heat outside had not relented. David hugged her again, and this time Margaret held on a little tighter, breathing in the scent of him, the scent of the little boy she used to rock to sleep, mixed with the expensive cologne of the stranger he was becoming. "I love you, Mom," David said. "I love you too, David. More than you know." Clara stood by the car waiting. She did not offer a hug this time. She simply waved a small, dismissive gesture. "Bye, Mother. Take care of yourself, and do try to remember things better, okay?" Margaret stood on the porch and watched them leave. She watched the silver Lexus back out of the driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust. She watched it disappear down the street until it was nothing but a glint of light in the distance. When they were gone, the silence returned heavier than before. Margaret turned and walked back into the empty house. She looked at the table with the half-eaten pie. She looked at the glass of iced tea. Clara had barely touched the condensation dripping down the side, creating a small pool of water on the wood. She sat down in the chair David had vacated. She placed her hands on the table and looked at them. They were old hands, wrinkled and spotted with age. But they were strong hands. These were hands that had scrubbed floors to pay for David's college. These were hands that had held a husband as he died. These were hands that had never taken a penny that did not belong to them. $5,000. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She did not cry. There was no room for tears now. Tears were for the helpless, and Margaret Hayes was not helpless. She was a mother, and someone was stealing from her family. She stood up and walked to the kitchen counter. There, sitting next to the phone, was a notepad she used for grocery lists. She picked up a pen. She wrote down the date. May 12th, Mother's Day. Underneath, she wrote a single sentence. David thinks he sends $5,000. Clara keeps it. She stared at the words. Seeing them in ink made them real. It transformed the vague suspicion into a concrete fact. She thought about the look in Clara's eyes, the threat, the arrogance. Clara thought Margaret was just a senile old woman who would fade away quietly. Clara thought she could buy silence with a smile and a lie. Margaret opened the drawer where she kept her old accounting books from the days when she served as the treasurer for the church. She pulled out a fresh ledger. It smelled of paper and discipline. She walked to the window and looked out at the dying Sunday. The heat was still rising from the ground, distorting the air. "You have made a mistake," Clara Margaret whispered to the empty room. "You forgot who I am. You forgot that before I was old I was sharp, and I am still his mother." She turned back to the room. The sadness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. She would not tell David. Not yet. Words were cheap, and David was blinded by love. If she told him now, it would be her word against Clara's, and Clara was the wife, the future. Margaret was just the past. No, she needed more than words. She needed proof. She needed evidence so undeniable that even a blind man could see the truth. Margaret Hayes picked up the phone and dialed a number she had not called in years. It was the number of an old friend from her accounting days, a woman named Betty, who now worked at the city bank. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. "Hello," a voice answered. Betty Margaret said, her voice steady and clear. "It is Margaret. Margaret Hayes. I need a favor. I need to know how to trace a wire transfer." She hung up the phone a few minutes later and sat in the dimming light. The apple pie sat on the counter, sweet and cooling. Margaret cut herself a slice. She ate it slowly, savoring the taste of cinnamon and apples. She needed her strength. The war had begun, and she intended to win. The Monday morning following Mother's Day arrived with a heavy, suffocating silence that seemed to press against the walls of Margaret Hayes's small house. The Texas heat was already rising, carrying with it the scent of dust and drying grass, but Margaret did not feel the warmth. Inside her veins ran a cold, steady current of determination that had kept her awake for most of the night. She sat at her kitchen table, a cup of black coffee cooling in front of her, and the leather-bound ledger open to a fresh page. The sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting intricate shadows across the paper, shadows that looked like a tangled web waiting to be unraveled. Margaret was no longer just a grandmother waiting for the mail or a widow tending to her garden. In the span of 24 hours, she had transformed into a woman on a mission. She remembered her husband Frank's voice echoing in her memory, telling her that trust was good but verification was better. Frank had been a pragmatic man, a man who checked the fence post twice before a storm. Margaret realized she had let the fences rot for too long. She had trusted blindly because it was easier to trust than to question the people she loved. But love, she was learning, could be a blinding fog. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing her navy blue Sunday dress and low-heeled shoes. She pinned her gray hair back into a neat bun and applied a touch of lipstick. It was armor. If she was going to walk into the world and demand answers, she needed to look like a woman who commanded respect, not a frail pensioner looking for a handout. She picked up her handbag, checking to make sure her identification and her old bank passbook were inside. Then she took a deep breath, locked the front door, and walked out into the blinding brightness of the day. Her destination was the First Texas Community Bank, a brick building downtown, where she had banked for over 40 years. It was not the massive international bank that David used for his corporate dealings, but it was the place where Betty worked. Betty Miller had been a friend since high school, a woman with hair the color of spun copper and a mind as sharp as a tack. If anyone could help Margaret navigate the murky waters of finance without alerting David, it was Betty. The bus ride into town was long and jarring. Margaret sat near the front, clutching her bag tightly, her eyes fixed on the passing landscape of strip malls and car dealerships. Every time she saw a luxury car, a flash of silver or white, she thought of Clara. She thought of the pearl silk dress and the dismissive wave of her hand. The anger simmered in her gut, not a hot explosive rage, but a slow-burning coal that provided her with the fuel she needed. When she entered the bank, the air conditioning hit her like a wall of ice. The smell of polished marble and currency filled her nose. She walked straight to the desk at the far end where Betty sat behind a glass partition typing furiously on a computer. Betty looked up, her glasses perched on the end of her nose, and her face broke into a warm, genuine smile. "Margaret Hayes, as I live and breathe," Betty exclaimed, standing up to open the side door. "To what do I owe the pleasure? Is it time for the church bake sale deposit already?" Margaret stepped into the small cubicle and waited for Betty to close the door. She did not smile back. The gravity on her face made Betty's smile falter and fade. "It is not the bake sale, Betty," Margaret said, her voice low and serious. "I need your help and I need your discretion. This cannot leave this room." Betty gestured for her to sit down, her expression shifting to professional concern. "Of course, Margaret. You know you can trust me. Is everything all right? Is it your health?" "It is about money," Margaret said, placing her hands on the desk to steady them. "It is about David and Clara." She told Betty everything. She spoke about the visit, the question David had asked, and the lie she had told to protect him. She spoke about the $5,000 a month that was supposedly being sent, and the 8 months of poverty she had endured. She spoke about the hunger, the fear of the utility bills, and the humiliation of accepting charity food. As she spoke, she watched Betty's face turn from confusion to shock and finally to a deep, empathetic outrage. "That little witch," Betty whispered, a term she rarely used. "She is skimming off the top. No, she is taking the whole cream and leaving you the empty bottle." "I need to know how she is doing it," Margaret said, leaning forward. "David says he transfers the money to her account on the 15th. She says she brings it to me, but there is no paper trail on my end. I need to know if there is any way to see where that money goes." Betty sighed, spinning her chair to face her computer screen. "Margaret, you know I cannot access David's accounts. He is with a different bank, a national chain. Privacy laws are strict. If I try to peek into an account that is not in our system or not under your name, I could lose my job and go to jail." "I know that," Margaret said quickly. "I am not asking you to hack into David's account. But I have a suspicion. Clara is smart, but she is also arrogant. Arrogant people make mistakes because they think no one is watching. I want you to check my name. Just my name, Margaret Hayes. Check if there are any other accounts opened under my name or any accounts linked to my social security number that I do not know about." Betty hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "That is still irregular, Margaret." "Please," Margaret's voice cracked slightly. "I am eating canned soup while she buys Chanel perfume with my son's money. I need to know if she is using my identity." Betty looked at her friend's pleading eyes and nodded decisively. "Give me your social security card." For the next 10 minutes, the only sound in the room was the clicking of keys and the hum of the computer fan. Margaret held her breath, watching the reflection of the screen in Betty's glasses. She prayed that she would find nothing, and at the same time prayed that she would find something. Finding nothing meant the money was simply stopping in Clara's pocket, which was theft. Finding something meant fraud, identity theft, and a level of betrayal that was criminal. Betty stopped typing. She leaned in closer to the screen, her brow furrowed. Margaret, Betty said softly. I found something. Margaret's heart stopped. What is it? There is a secondary savings account here, Betty said, pointing to the screen. It is not with us, it is with a partner credit union that shares our database for credit checks. It was opened 8 months ago. The primary name on the account is Clara Hayes, but it is listed as a custodial account for a dependent. The dependent listed is Margaret Hayes. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. A custodial account. That meant Clara had declared Margaret incompetent or dependent, claiming she needed to manage Margaret's finances for her. Does it show the balance? Margaret asked, her voice barely a whisper. Betty clicked a few more keys. I can only see the summary, not the transaction details, but the current balance is less than $100. Less than $100. $40,000 had flowed into that account over 8 months, and it was empty. Can you see the deposits? Margaret asked. I see regular incoming transfers, Betty confirmed. $5,000. Every month around the 15th. And then, Betty squinted. Then almost immediately there are withdrawals. Large ones. Transfers to credit card payments, transfers to luxury car leasing agencies, and cash withdrawals at ATMs in expensive shopping districts. Margaret closed her eyes. The puzzle pieces slammed together with a sickening crunch. Clara had not just stolen the money. She had used Margaret's name to set up a laundering point. She had convinced David to send the money to this specific account, likely telling him it was a joint account for his mother's care. David, seeing his mother's name on the transfer receipt, would never suspect a thing. He would think the money was sitting there waiting for Margaret to use it. Can you print that? Margaret asked, opening her eyes. I cannot print the official statement, Betty said, shaking her head regretfully. But I can print a screen capture of the account existence and the custodial linkage. It proves that an account exists in your name that you did not open. Do it, Margaret said. 5 minutes later, Margaret walked out of the bank with a folded piece of paper tucked deep inside her bra. She felt as if she were carrying a grenade. She had the first link in the chain. Clara had opened a secret account using Margaret as a shield. But this was not enough. A screen capture from a local bank was a start, but it would not hold up if Clara claimed it was just a misunderstanding or a technical error. Clara could say she opened the account to help Margaret and simply spent the money on Margaret's behalf, paying bills or buying groceries. She could lie and say Margaret asked for the cash. Margaret needed to prove that the money never reached her. She needed to prove that the spending was for Clara, not for Margaret. She needed access to the spending history, and for that she needed someone on the inside of David's company. Margaret went home and made herself a sandwich, which she barely ate. She sat by the phone staring at it. She knew David's company, Hayes and Partners, had a large accounting department. She remembered David mentioning a man named Bennett, a chief accountant who had been with the firm since the beginning. David trusted Bennett. He had called him the moral compass of the company. Margaret had met Bennett once at a company Christmas party 5 years ago. He was a stern man with graying hair and a handshake that felt like gripping a stone. He was not a man who smiled easily, but he was a man who respected rules. Margaret looked at the clock. It was 2 in the afternoon. Bennett would be at his desk. She picked up the receiver and dialed the main line of Hayes and Partners. Hayes and Partners, how may I direct your call? The receptionist chirped. I would like to speak to Mr. Bennett in accounting, please, Margaret said, pitching her voice to be as authoritative as possible. May I ask who is calling? This is Margaret Hayes, David Hayes's mother. It is a personal matter regarding a family financial discrepancy. There was a pause. The name Hayes carried weight. One moment, please, Mrs. Hayes. I will put you through. The line clicked and a terrible hold music began to play. Margaret's hand was sweating against the plastic of the phone. What if he refused to talk to her? What if he told David immediately? She was taking a massive risk. This is Bennett. A deep, gravelly voice came on the line. Mrs. Hayes, is everything all right with David? Mr. Bennett, Margaret said, keeping her voice steady. David is fine. I am calling you because I need your help and I need your discretion. I am conducting an audit of my own personal records, and I have found a discrepancy involving the monthly transfers from the company payroll that are supposed to come to me." Bennett was silent for a moment. He was a man of numbers, and the word discrepancy likely set off alarm bells in his head. "Discrepancy," he repeated. "Mrs. Hayes, the company processes those transfers automatically. $5,000 deducted from David's distribution sent to the account on file. I sign off on them myself." "I know you do, Mr. Bennett," Margaret said, "and I do not doubt your efficiency, but I have reason to believe the account on file is not mine, or rather it is in my name but I do not have access to it." There was a long silence on the other end. Margaret could hear the faint sound of typing. "Mrs. Hayes," Bennett said slowly, his voice dropping an octave, "are you suggesting that the funds are being diverted?" "I am suggesting that for the past 8 months I have not received a single penny of the $40,000 that my son believes he is sending me." The silence stretched again, but this time it felt heavier. Bennett was calculating. He was an auditor at heart. He hunted errors. He hunted fraud. "If that is true, Mrs. Hayes, then we have a significant problem," Bennett said. "That would mean someone falsified the direct deposit authorization forms." "Exactly," Margaret said. "Mr. Bennett, I am asking you as a mother who loves her son. Do not tell David yet. If we go to him with just suspicions, it will break his heart, and it might cause the person responsible to cover their tracks. I need proof. I need to know where that money went after it left your company." "Who do you suspect?" Mrs. Hayes, Bennett asked, though his tone suggested he already had an idea. "The account is jointly held by Clara Hayes," Margaret said. She heard a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Clara had access to the company accounts too, or at least the company credit cards for spousal expenses. Bennett likely knew things about Clara's spending habits that he had kept to himself because it was not his place to judge the boss's wife. "Mrs. Hayes," Bennett said, his voice firm, "now. I cannot give you the bank records directly as they belong to the employee. However, if there is a suspicion of fraud involving company payroll, I have a duty to investigate. I can pull the authorization forms, I can see who signed them, and I can look at the secondary company credit card usage. If she is diverting payroll, she might be abusing other privileges too." "Thank you, Bennett." Margaret breathed out, feeling her knees go weak. "Thank you. Give me a week," Bennett said. "I need to be thorough. If I am going to accuse the CEO's wife of embezzlement, I need to be bulletproof. I will mail the documents to your home address. Do not come to the office." "It is too risky." "I will wait," Margaret said. She hung up the phone and sat back in her chair. The house was quiet again, but it felt different. It was no longer a prison of poverty. It was a command center. She had an ally in the bank and an ally in the company. She had started the machinery of justice. But a week was a long time. And in that week she had to play the part. She had to be the forgetful, sweet old mother. She had to endure Clara's visits and Clara's lies without cracking. 2 days later, on a Wednesday afternoon, the familiar sound of the silver Lexus purred in the driveway. Margaret was in the garden watering her lavender bushes. She stiffened, gripping the garden hose until her knuckles turned white. She forced herself to relax her muscles, to take a deep breath, and to plaster a gentle, vacant smile on her face. Clara stepped out of the car. She was wearing a white linen suit today, looking crisp and professional. She held a small basket wrapped in cellophane and gold ribbon. Mother, Clara called out, waving. "I was in the neighborhood and thought I would stop by." Margaret turned off the water and wiped her hands on her apron. "Hello, Clara. What a nice surprise." Clara walked up the path, her heels clicking on the stepping stones. She thrust the basket toward Margaret. "Just some goodies. Organic jams and some crackers. I know how much you like sweets." Margaret took the basket. It felt light cheap. Probably a promotional gift Clara had received for free at some event. "Thank you, Clara. You are always so thoughtful." Clara smiled, that tight practice smile. "David wanted to come, but he is swamped. He asked me to bring you the envelope." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the lie. "Oh," Margaret said, widening her eyes innocently. "That is wonderful. I have some bills piling up." Clara patted her oversized designer tote bag. "Yes, I have it right here." "Oh, wait." Clara frowned, rummaging through the bag. She pulled out a wallet, a phone, a makeup case, but no envelope. She stopped and looked up at Margaret with a performance of confusion that deserved an award. "Oh, silly me," Clara laughed, a tinkling sound like glass breaking. "I must have left it in the glove compartment of the other car, or maybe on the kitchen counter. I was in such a rush today." Margaret watched her carefully. She saw the lack of genuine concern in Clara's eyes. It was a script she had played before. "That is okay, dear," Margaret said, her voice soft. "You can bring it next time." Clara let out a sigh of relief. "You are the best mother. Most people would be so annoyed. I will double the amount next month, I promise. I will have David send extra." Margaret knew there would be no extra. There would only be another excuse. But she nodded. "Do not worry about it. The Lord provides." Clara glanced around the garden. "You really should hire a gardener, Mother. This looks exhausting." "It keeps me busy," Margaret said. Clara checked her watch. "I have to run. Yoga appointment. You know how stress gets to me." "Yes," Margaret said, looking at the woman who was stealing her livelihood to pay for yoga and linen suits. "Stress is a terrible thing." As Clara walked back to the car, Margaret noticed something. In the back seat of the Lexus, there were shopping bags. Several of them. The logos were visible through the tinted glass. Gucci, Neiman Marcus. A jewelry store box sat on the top of the pile. Margaret stood there in the heat, clutching the basket of jam. $5,000 would pay for a lot of shopping bags. She waited until the car was gone. Then she walked inside, went to the kitchen table, and opened her journal. She wrote down the date. May 15th. She wrote, "Clara visited, brought jam, claimed she forgot the money in the other car, driving the new Lexus, shopping bags in the back seat, Gucci, jewelry. She lied to my face and smiled while doing it." Margaret closed the book. The anger was hotter now, closer to the surface. But she pushed it down. She had to wait for Bennett. She had to wait for the paper trail. That night, Margaret sat on her porch. The air had cooled slightly, and the crickets were singing their rhythmic song. She looked at the stars hanging low and bright over the Texas horizon. She thought about David working late in his office, believing his wife was taking care of his mother. He was a victim, too. He was being played just as much as she was. Margaret promised herself that when the truth came out, she would not just be fighting for her money. She would be fighting for her son's freedom. She would be fighting to open his eyes. The week dragged on. Every time the mail carrier arrived, Margaret's heart would race. She watched for the white Jeep of the Postal Service like a hawk. Thursday passed. Friday passed. Saturday came and went with nothing but flyers and bills. Sunday was quiet. Margaret went to church and prayed. She prayed for patience. She prayed for strength. She did not pray for Clara. She felt that Clara was beyond the reach of her prayers right now. Then on Tuesday morning, 9 days after she had called Bennett, the mail carrier stopped at her box. He shoved a thick, large envelope inside. It was brown manila, and it looked heavy. Margaret walked to the mailbox, her legs feeling like they were moving through water. She pulled the envelope out. It had no return address, only a stamp that said confidential in red ink. She took it inside and laid it on the kitchen table. She made a cup of tea. She needed to be calm. She sat down, took a sip of the hot liquid, and picked up a letter opener. She sliced the envelope open. Inside was a stack of papers an inch thick. On top was a handwritten note on plain paper. "Mrs. Hayes, here is what I found. It is worse than we thought. The authorization for the direct deposit was indeed signed, but the signature is a forgery. I compared it to your signature on file from the company insurance documents 5 years ago. It is a good forgery, but it is not yours. Furthermore, I have included copies of the credit card statements for the secondary card issued to Clara. You will see charges that coincide with the dates of the withdrawals from the savings account. It appears she is using the stolen payroll to pay off the credit card bills, effectively hiding the spending from David, who only looks at the primary account balance. I am ready to testify to this if needed. Bennett." Margaret moved the note aside and looked at the documents. There they were. Rows and rows of numbers. Transfer out, $5,000, May 15. Transfer out, $5,000, April 15. Transfer out, $5,000, March 15. And then the credit card statements. The spa at the Ritz-Carlton, $600. Diamond District Jewelers, $2,500. Flight to Cabo San Lucas, $1,200. Boutique Italia, $3. Margaret read every line. She traced every dollar. It was a map of greed. While Margaret sat in the dark to save electricity, Clara was flying to Mexico. While Margaret ate toast for dinner, Clara was eating at 5-star steakhouses. Margaret felt a tear slide down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure crystallization. The doubt was gone. The hope that it was all a misunderstanding was dead. She gathered the papers and put them back in the envelope. She stood up and walked to the window. The sun was blazing again, indifferent to the crimes of men. Margaret Hayes wiped her face. She went to her bedroom and pulled a small metal lockbox from under her bed. She placed the envelope inside next to her husband's watch and her marriage certificate. She locked it and put the key in her pocket. Now she had the weapon. But she was not going to fire it yet. A lawyer once told her husband that you never ask a question in court unless you already know the answer. Margaret decided she would not confront Clara until Clara had nowhere left to run. She needed a stage. She needed an audience. She needed David to see the truth not just on paper but with his own eyes. She picked up the phone again. This time she dialed the number of a local attorney, Amelia Rowe, a woman who specialized in elder law and who had a reputation for being a shark in a skirt. Amelia, Margaret said when the woman answered. "I have a case for you, and I have the evidence, but I want to handle this creatively." Margaret began to outline a plan. It was a plan that involved a dinner, a family dinner, a dinner where the main course would be the truth served cold. The office of Amelia Rowe was located in a restored brick building on the edge of the historic district, a place where old oak trees shaded the sidewalks and the air smelled of rain on hot pavement. Inside the office was a sanctuary of dark wood and leather, contrasting sharply with the chaos of Margaret's recent discoveries. Amelia sat behind a massive mahogany desk, her sharp green eyes scanning the documents Bennett had sent. She was a woman in her 40s with a reputation for being ruthless in the courtroom but gentle with her clients. She had known Margaret for years, having helped with the probate when Frank passed away. Amelia lowered the papers and took off her reading glasses. She looked at Margaret, who sat upright in the guest chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap over her purse. "Margaret," Amelia said, her voice controlled but edged with anger, "this is textbook. It is financial elder abuse, plain and simple. We have the forged signature on the authorization form. We have the custodial account opened without your consent. We have the credit card statements showing lifestyle spending that clearly does not benefit you. I can file an emergency injunction this afternoon. We can freeze her assets and have the police at her door by dinner time." Margaret shook her head slowly. "No, Amelia, not yet." Amelia leaned forward. "Margaret, you are living on canned soup. This woman has stolen $40,000 from you in less than a year. Every day we wait is another day she might spend more, or worse, hide the rest. Why wait? Because if I send the police now, she will spin a story," Margaret said. "She will tell David that she was just managing the money for me. She will say I am confused or senile. She will cry and play the victim, and David, being the soft-hearted man he is, might believe her. He loves her, Amelia. He is blind to her faults because he wants to see the best in people. If I attack her with the law first, he will feel attacked too. He will feel like I am attacking his judgment, his marriage." "So what is the plan?" Amelia asked, tapping her pen against the desk. "I need him to see it," Margaret said. "I need him to hear the lie come out of her mouth and then see the truth with his own eyes in the same moment. I need the betrayal to be undeniable." Amelia sat back and studied Margaret. She saw the steel in the older woman's eyes, the resolve that had replaced the grief. She nodded slowly. "You want to trap her," Amelia stated. "I want to invite them to dinner," Margaret corrected. "A special dinner. I want you to prepare the legal paperwork, the full lawsuit ready to be filed. Put it in a nice official folder. I will invite them over this Sunday. That is the 16th. The transfer usually happens on the 15th, so the money will be fresh in David's mind." Amelia smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "You want me to come to dinner?" "No," Margaret said. "That would scare her off too soon. I want you to be the backup. I want you to have the papers delivered. Or better yet, I will have Bennett bring them. He is the one who found the proof. He represents the company. If he walks in, it is not just a family dispute, it is corporate business." "That is brilliant," Amelia admitted. "Bennett carries the weight of David's authority. If he walks in and says she stole, she cannot argue." "Exactly," Margaret said. "I will cook a roast. I will make it a lovely evening. And then when she feels safe, when she lies about the money again, I will let the truth in through the front door." Amelia opened her drawer and pulled out a fresh legal pad. "Okay, Margaret, let us get everything in order. I will draft the complaint. We will demand full restitution plus legal fees and damages. We will also prepare a document for David to sign, removing her from all accounts immediately. Thank you, Amelia, Margaret said, standing up. One more thing, Margaret, Amelia said, her voice softening. Be careful. Narcissists do not go down quietly. When they are cornered, they bite. She will try to hurt you. She will try to say things to David to poison him against you. You have to be ready for that. I have already lost my husband and I have lived through poverty, Margaret said, adjusting her shawl. There is nothing she can say that will hurt more than what she has already done. Margaret left the law office feeling lighter than she had in months. The plan was in motion. But as she walked to the bus stop, a sudden wave of dizziness hit her. The heat was ferocious today, 100 degrees in the shade. She sat heavily on the bench, fanning herself with a folded newspaper. She realized she had not eaten lunch. She checked her purse. She had exactly $5.40. Enough for a sandwich, or enough for the bus fare home, but not both. She chose the bus fare. She would eat an extra slice of toast when she got home. As she waited, a sleek black convertible pulled up to the traffic light right in front of the bus stop. The top was down. Music thumped from the speakers, a heavy bass beat that vibrated in Margaret's chest. She looked up and froze. It was Clara. She was in the passenger seat of a car Margaret did not recognize. Driving was a man Margaret had never seen before, a younger man with slicked-back dark hair and expensive sunglasses. Clara was laughing, her head thrown back, her golden hair catching the wind. She held a shopping bag from Saks Fifth Avenue in her lap. She looked radiant, carefree, and utterly devoid of guilt. The light turned green. The car screeched away, leaving behind the smell of burnt rubber and exhaust. Margaret sat there stunned. Who was the man? Was he just a friend? A cousin? Or was this another layer of the betrayal? She felt a physical sickness rise in her throat. David was working 12-hour days. He often told Margaret he was exhausted, that the merger was draining him. And here was his wife riding around in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon with a strange man spending David's money and laughing. Margaret gripped the handle of her purse until her knuckles ached. She had been angry about the money, but this was disrespect on a visceral level. This was a mockery of her son's love. The bus arrived, wheezing and rattling. Margaret boarded, paying her fare with trembling fingers. She found a seat by the window and stared out at the passing city. The image of Clara laughing burned in her mind. I will not just expose you, Margaret thought. I will ruin you. For David's sake, I will ensure you never hurt him again. When she got home, she went straight to the phone. She needed to set the trap before her courage failed or before her anger made her do something rash. She dialed David's cell phone number. It went to voicemail on the first ring. Hi, you have reached David Hayes. I am in a meeting or flying. Leave a message. David, it is Mom, Margaret said, keeping her voice light and sweet. I was just hoping to see you and Clara this weekend. I am making my pot roast. I know how much you love it. And I thought maybe we could celebrate. Well, just celebrate family. It has been a while since we had a real Sunday dinner. Please let me know if you can come. Sunday around 6. Love you. She hung up. Now she had to wait. Wednesday passed, with no reply. Margaret cleaned the house. She scrubbed the baseboards. She washed the curtains. She polished the silverware that had been a wedding gift from her mother. Physical labor kept her mind from spiraling. Thursday evening, the phone rang. Hey, Mom. It was David. He sounded exhausted, his voice raspy. David, Margaret said, sitting down. How are you, honey? I am beat, Mom. This merger is a nightmare. The lawyers are eating me alive. I am sorry to hear that, Margaret said soothingly. You need a break. You need a good meal. Yeah, I got your message, David said. Sunday sounds good. I think we can make it. I have to fly to New York on Monday morning, so a quiet dinner would be nice. Wonderful, Margaret said. Is Clara around? Yeah, she is right here. Hold on. There was a muffled sound, then Clara's voice came on the line. Hi, Mother. Hello, Clara, Margaret said. I am so glad you can come on Sunday. We would not miss it, Clara said, though. Her tone suggested she would rather be anywhere else. David has been craving your roast. Good, Margaret said. And Clara, I was wondering, since it will be the 16th, do you think you could bring the envelope then? I hate to ask, but the electric bill is due on Monday. There was a pause. Margaret could almost hear Clara rolling her eyes. Oh, right, Clara said. Yes, of course, Mother. I will make sure to stop by the bank on Friday. Do not worry. "Thank you, dear," Margaret said. "You are a lifesaver." She hung up the phone and allowed herself a small dark smile. She had baited the hook. Clara had confirmed she would bring the money. When she arrived empty-handed again, it would be the first strike. Friday came. Margaret went to the grocery store. She had saved a small amount of cash from selling some old books at a second-hand shop. She bought a nice piece of beef chuck, roast carrots, potatoes, and onions. She bought a bottle of red wine, not the expensive kind David drank, but a decent table wine. She wanted everything to look normal. She wanted the house to smell like comfort and safety. Saturday was the day of mental preparation. Margaret spent hours reading over the documents Bennett had sent. She memorized the dates and the amounts. She wanted to be able to recite them without looking. March 15th, $5,000. The Ritz-Carlton, $600. April 15th, $5,000. Flight to Cabo, $1,200. She rehearsed the conversation in her head. She imagined Clara's excuses. She imagined David's confusion. She prepared her responses. She was writing a script for a play where she was the director and Clara was the unwitting star. She also called Bennett. "Mr. Bennett, are we still on for Sunday?" "Yes," Mrs. Hayes Bennett said. "I have the file ready. What time do you want me there?" "Come at 6:30, Margaret said. "We will sit down to eat at 6. I want us to be settled. Park down the street so they do not see your car. Just knock on the door." "I will be there," Bennett promised. "Good luck, Mrs. Hayes." Sunday arrived. The heat had broken slightly thanks to a brief morning storm, leaving the air humid and heavy. Margaret started cooking at noon. The smell of searing beef and onions filled the small house, chasing away the scent of old dust. She set the table with her best tablecloth, a white linen, one with lace edges. She put out the good china, the plates with the delicate blue floral pattern that she only used for Christmas and Easter. She placed 3 chairs around the table. Then she went to her bedroom and opened the lockbox. She took out the envelope Bennett had sent. She also took out the screen capture Betty had given her. She placed them inside a large decorative serving bowl that had a lid. She placed the bowl on the sideboard near the dining table. It looked like just another serving dish waiting to be filled with mashed potatoes. But inside it held the bomb that would blow up Clara's world. At 5:45, Margaret was ready. She wore her best dress, a soft lavender floral print. She had curled her hair. She stood by the window watching the street. At exactly 6 o'clock, the silver Lexus pulled up. Margaret's stomach gave a nervous flutter, but she pushed it down. She breathed in, she breathed out. She was ready. She opened the door as they walked up the steps. David looked even more tired than he had on Mother's Day. He wore a casual button-down shirt, but it was wrinkled as if he had grabbed it from a pile. Clara, however, looked impeccable. She wore a dress of emerald green silk that hugged her curves, and her hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail. She wore large diamond stud earrings that caught the porch light. "Something smelled amazing," David said, managing a tired smile as he kissed Margaret's cheek. "Pot roast," Margaret said, holding him for a second longer than usual. "Just the way you like it." Clara breezed past, offering a quick air kiss near Margaret's ear. "Hello, Mother. The house is cozy as always." "Come in, sit down," Margaret said. "I have wine poured." They settled at the table. The air conditioner window unit Margaret had turned on an hour ago was rattling away, trying its best to cool the room. It was still warm but bearable. David took a long sip of wine. "This is good, Mom. I needed this." Clara took a tiny sip and wrinkled her nose slightly but said nothing. She set the glass down and looked at her phone, which was sitting on the table next to her fork. "No phones at the table," Margaret said gently but firmly. "It is a family rule, remember." Clara sighed and slid the phone into her purse. "Sorry. I am just waiting for an email from my yoga instructor." Margaret served the food. She ladled big portions of tender beef and vegetables onto David's plate. She gave Clara a smaller portion, knowing she would barely eat. "So David," Margaret asked as they began to eat, "how is the merger going?" "It is brutal," David said, talking with his mouth slightly full. "The other company is hiding debt, I think. Bennett is digging through their books, but it is slow going. I trust Bennett, though. If there is a penny missing, he will find it." Margaret smiled. "Yes, Bennett seems like a very thorough man. Very honest. He is the best." David nodded. "I would trust him with my life. He is the only reason I can sleep at night, knowing the numbers are real." Clara shifted in her chair. "Can we not talk about business, David? It is Sunday." You are right, David said. Sorry, honey. Sorry, Mom. So Margaret said, turning to Clara. How was your week, Clara? Did you do anything exciting? Oh, just the usual, Clara said, picking at a carrot. Jim errands some charity work. It keeps me busy. Charity work? Margaret asked. That is wonderful. Which charity? Oh, a local one, Clara said vaguely. For underprivileged children. We are organizing a gala. That sounds expensive, Margaret said. It is, Clara said. But it is for a good cause. Margaret took a bite of her roast. The meat was tender, melting in her mouth. She chewed slowly, watching Clara. Did you manage to go to the bank? Margaret asked casually. Clara froze mid-chew. She swallowed hard. Oh, the bank. Yes, the envelope, Margaret said. You said on the phone you would go on Friday. Clara let out a nervous laugh. Oh, Mother, I am so sorry. I completely forgot. The gala planning was crazy on Friday. I was running around all day. Margaret nodded slowly. I see. You were running around all day. Yes, Clara said, gaining confidence. I did not have a moment to breathe. That is strange, Margaret said, her voice turning slightly colder. Because I could have sworn I saw you on Tuesday. Clara blinked. Tuesday. Yes, Margaret continued. I was waiting for the bus downtown. And I saw a black convertible. You were in the passenger seat. Clara's face went pale. The color drained from her cheeks so fast it looked like a magic trick. She gripped her fork. Oh, that, Clara stammered. That must have been my friend Mark. He gave me a lift to the charity meeting. Mark, Margaret repeated. A young man. Dark hair. Very handsome. David looked up from his plate. Mark. Who is Mark? I do not know a Mark. Clara turned to David, placing a hand on his arm. Oh, you know him, sweetie. He is the event coordinator for the gala. He is gay. Just a friend. Margaret watched the lie spill out of Clara's mouth. It was smooth practiced. But Margaret saw the sweat beading on Clara's upper lip. He had a very nice car, Margaret said. Convertible, top down. And you had a lot of shopping bags, Clara. Saks Fifth Avenue, I believe. Clara pulled her hand back. Well, yes. We had to buy decorations for the gala. Decorations from Saks Fifth Avenue, Margaret asked, raising an eyebrow. Clara's eyes narrowed. She realized Margaret was cornering her. Why are you interrogating me, Mother? I told you I am busy helping people. I am just curious, Margaret said, taking a sip of wine. Curious about how you have time for charity and shopping, but no time to go to the bank for your mother-in-law who is struggling to buy groceries. David put his fork down. The tension in the room had spiked. Mom, what is going on? You sound upset. I am upset, David, Margaret said, looking at her son. I am upset because I have asked for that envelope for 8 months. And for 8 months there is always an excuse. The bank is closed. I forgot. I left it in the car. I was too busy. David looked at Clara. Honey, did you forget again? I told you to set a reminder. I am trying, David. Clara snapped, her voice sharp. I have a life too, you know. I am not just a delivery service. No, you are not, Margaret said. You are the keeper of the money. $5,000 a month. Where is it, Clara? Clara stood up, throwing her napkin on the table. I do not have to sit here and be attacked. I forgot the money, okay? I will bring it tomorrow. I promise. Can we please drop it? Sit down, Clara, Margaret said. Her voice was not loud, but it had a command in it that made David jump. Mom. David started. Sit down, Margaret repeated, looking at Clara. Clara hesitated, then slowly sat back down. Her eyes were darting around the room like a trapped animal. I do not want the money tomorrow, Margaret said. I do not want the money ever again. I want the truth. What truth? David asked, looking between the two women. What are you talking about? Margaret stood up. She walked to the sideboard and picked up the decorative bowl. She removed the lid. She reached inside and pulled out the thick envelope. She walked back to the table and placed the envelope in front of David. Open it, Margaret said. David looked at the envelope. He looked at his mother. He saw the sadness in her eyes, the deep, profound disappointment. Then he looked at his wife. Clara was staring at the envelope with pure terror. David, do not, Clara whispered. She is. She is confused. She does not know what that is. Open it, son, Margaret said. David reached out. His hand trembled slightly. He picked up the envelope. He slid his finger under the flap and tore it open. He pulled out the stack of papers. The first page was the email from Bennett. David recognized the letterhead. He recognized the font. He recognized the signature. He began to read. The room was silent except for the rattling of the air conditioner. Margaret watched David's face. She saw his eyes scan the page. She saw his brow furrow. She saw his lips part in shock. He flipped to the next page. The bank transfer records. He flipped again. The credit card statements. He flipped again. The forged signature comparison. David's face turned red, then a sickly shade of gray. He looked up at Bennett's note again. Fraud. Forgery. Asterisk embezzlement. Asterisk. He looked at the dates. May 15, April 15. He looked at the credit card charges, the Ritz-Carlton, the flight to Cabo. He slowly lowered the papers to the table. He looked at Clara. His expression was not one of anger yet. It was one of total incomprehension. It was the look of a man whose reality had just cracked open. Clara, he said, his voice shaking. What is this? Clara reached for the papers, but David slammed his hand down on them. Do not touch them, he roared. Clara flinched. David, it is not what it looks like. I can explain. Explain, David asked, holding up a page. Explain why Bennett says you forged Mom's signature. Explain why the money I sent for Mom is paying for a flight to Cabo. When did you go to Cabo, Clara? You told me you were visiting your sister in Austin. Clara was crying now. Big alligator tears. David, please. I was stressed. I needed a break. I intended to pay it back. I swear. Pay it back, Margaret said softly. With what, Clara? With next month's transfer. You were robbing Peter to pay Paul, but Peter is your husband, and Paul is a luxury resort. David looked at his mother. Mom, you have not received anything. Nothing, Margaret said. For 8 months, David. I have been living on food from the church pantry. I walked here to the store because I had no gas money. I sat in the dark to save electricity. David put his head in his hands. Oh my God. Mom, why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted to trust you, Margaret said. And because she made me feel like I was the crazy one. She told me I was forgetful. She told you I was senile. She gaslighted us both, son. Just then, there was a knock at the door. 3 sharp raps. Clara jumped. Who is that? She gasped. Margaret walked to the door. She unlocked it and opened it wide. Bennett stood there holding a briefcase. He wore a dark suit despite the heat. He looked like an executioner. Good evening, Mrs. Hayes, Bennett said, stepping inside. David looked up and saw his chief accountant. Bennett. Mr. Hayes, Bennett said, nodding gravely. I apologize for interrupting your dinner, but your mother asked me to bring the original files, and I believe we need to discuss the company credit card misuse immediately. Clara stood up, knocking her chair over. You set me up, she screamed at Margaret. You planned this. You old witch. Yes, Margaret said calmly. I did. Because you underestimated me, Clara. You thought I was just a helpless old woman. You forgot that a mother will do anything to protect her child, even from his own wife. David stood up slowly. He looked at Clara, then at Bennett, then at his mother. The shock was fading, replaced by a cold, hard fury. Bennett, David said. How much? In total, Bennett said, opening his briefcase. Between the diverted payroll and the unauthorized credit card charges, $47,800. David turned to Clara. Get out. David, please, Clara sobbed, reaching for him. Get out, David screamed. Get out of my mother's house. Get out of my life. Clara looked at him, terrified by the rage in his eyes. She looked at Bennett, who was blocking the kitchen. She looked at Margaret, who stood tall and unwavering. Fine, Clara spat, wiping her face. Keep your miserable money, and keep your miserable mother. I am leaving. She grabbed her purse and ran out the door. They heard her heels clattering down the steps, then the car door slam and the engine roar to life. Silence returned to the dining room. The pot roast sat cold on the plates. David stood there, his chest heaving. Then he collapsed back into his chair and buried his face in his hands, sobbing like a child. Margaret walked over to him. She wrapped her arms around his head, pressing him into her apron. I am sorry, Mom, David sobbed. I am so sorry. Shh, Margaret whispered, stroking his hair. It is over now. The truth is here, and the truth will set us free. Bennett stood quietly by the door, respectful of the moment. He knew his work was done. The numbers had spoken. Outside the night was dark, but inside the light of truth burned bright and painful, clearing away the shadows of 8 months of lies. The silence that followed Clara's departure was heavy, but it was the kind of heaviness that comes after a fever breaks. Bennett quietly gathered his papers back into his briefcase. He placed a hand on David's shoulder, a gesture of professional solidarity mixed with personal sympathy. "I will file the fraud report with the bank first thing tomorrow morning," Bennett said, his voice low. "We will freeze the secondary cards, and I will initiate an internal audit to ensure no other company funds were compromised. You should contact your personal attorney regarding the marital assets immediately, David. Do not wait." David nodded, his eyes red and swollen. "Thank you, Bennett. For everything. And for being honest when I was too blind to look." Bennett looked at Margaret and gave a small, respectful nod. "Your mother is a formidable woman, David. You would do well to listen to her more often." With that, the accountant left, closing the door softly behind him. Margaret and David were alone in the small living room. The air conditioner rattled on, but the oppressive heat of the deception had lifted. David stood up and walked around the room as if seeing it for the first time in years. He touched the peeling paint on the windowsill. He looked at the worn carpet that Margaret had tried to cover with throw rugs. He walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. Margaret tried to stop him, moving quickly to block his view, but she was too late. David stared into the illuminated box. It was starkly empty. A half loaf of bread, a jar of generic mustard, and a pitcher of water. There were no vegetables, no meat, other than the roast she had cooked that evening, no fruit. He stood there for a long time, the cold air from the fridge washing over him. When he turned back to Margaret, his face was crumpled with fresh grief. "This is how you have been living," he whispered. "While I was flying first class and Clara was buying diamonds, you were starving." "I was not starving, David." Margaret said, her voice fierce. "I was surviving. There is a difference." "You should not have had to survive," David said, slamming the fridge door shut. "You should have been thriving. I sent that money so you could travel, so you could fix the roof, so you could eat whatever you wanted. And instead..." He sank onto one of the kitchen chairs and put his head in his hands. "I failed you, Mom. I let a stranger come into our lives and treat you like a beggar." Margaret pulled a chair close to him and took his hands in hers. Her hands were rough with work, his were soft with office labor, but they held on to each other tightly. "You did not fail me in your heart, son," Margaret said firmly. "You were deceived. There is no shame in being tricked by someone you love. The shame belongs to the deceiver, not the deceived. But now you know, and now you fix it." David looked up, the steel returning to his eyes. "Yes, I will fix it." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity that transformed the quiet house into a center of operations. David did not return to the mansion he shared with Clara. He stayed in his old childhood bedroom, sleeping on the twin mattress that still smelled of the cedar chest. On Monday morning, they went to Amelia Rowe's office. This time, Margaret did not go alone. She walked in with her son by her side. Amelia greeted them with a grim satisfaction. She had the paperwork ready. David sat across from the lawyer, his demeanor cold and businesslike. "I want a full forensic accounting of our marriage," he told Amelia. "I want every penny she took from my mother returned. I do not care if she has to sell her jewelry, her clothes, or her car. That money goes back to my mother, and I want a divorce filed on the grounds of financial fraud and adultery." Amelia nodded, her pen flying across the legal pad. "We can certainly do that. With the evidence, Mrs. Hayes and Bennett provided, we have a rock-solid case. Clara will likely settle to avoid jail time. If we press criminal charges for the identity theft, she could be looking at prison." David hesitated for a fraction of a second, then looked at Margaret. "Mom, it is your name she used. It is your call. Do you want to see her in handcuffs?" Margaret thought about it. She thought about the humiliation of the past 8 months. She thought about the hunger. But she also thought about the young woman who had sat at her table, desperate for status, desperate for money so empty inside that she had to steal to feel full. "I want my money back," Margaret said slowly, "and I want her out of our lives. If she pays every cent back and agrees to leave us alone, I will not press criminal charges. I do not need revenge, David. I just need justice, and I do not want you to have to visit your ex-wife in prison. It would keep the wound open." David squeezed her hand. "You are too kind, Mom, but we will do it your way." The weeks that followed were difficult but healing. Clara tried to fight at first. She hired a lawyer, she made threats, she cried to mutual friends. But when Amelia presented the stack of evidence, the credit card receipts, the flight logs, the forged signatures, her fight evaporated. She signed the divorce papers. She liquidated her assets to repay the $40,000 plus interest. The day the check arrived, Margaret held it in her hands. It was just a slip of paper, but it represented her dignity returned. David did not stop there. He hired a contractor to fix the roof. He replaced the old rattling air conditioner with a central cooling system. He filled the fridge with groceries, so much food that Margaret had to tell him to stop because it would spoil before she could eat it all. But the most important thing he did was not financial. He started coming over every Sunday. Just him. No phones, no business talk. Just a son sitting with his mother eating pot roast or apple pie and talking about life. One evening, a month after the dust had settled, they were sitting on the porch. The new air conditioner hummed quietly in the background, a sound of luxury Margaret was still getting used to. The sun was setting, painting the Texas sky in shades of bruised purple and burnt orange. David looked at Margaret. "Mom, I have been thinking." "What about?" Margaret asked, rocking in her chair. "About what you went through," David said. "You fought for yourself. You investigated. You gathered evidence. You stood up to her. I always thought I was the one taking care of you. But you were the one taking care of me. You saved me from a lie I would have lived in for the rest of my life." Margaret smiled, looking out at the lavender bushes. "A mother's job is never done, David. We protect our children whether they are 6 or 36. David stood up and kissed her forehead. "I promise you, Mom. I will never be blind again." "I know," Margaret said softly. As the stars began to appear, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace settling over the house. The storm had passed, the damage had been repaired. And though the scars remained, they were fading, serving only as reminders of the strength it took to heal. She looked at her son, who was now watering the plants for her, a task he used to hate as a boy. He looked lighter, happier. The weight of the toxic marriage was gone. Margaret realized that the $5,000 had been the price of the lesson. It was a steep price, but in the end, it had bought them something priceless. It had bought them the truth. And it had given Margaret her son back, not the busy, distracted executive, but the man with a good heart she had raised. She closed her eyes and listened to the water splashing on the leaves. The nightmare was over. The morning had come. 1 year later, the Texas spring arrived with a riot of color that seemed to celebrate the new life Margaret Hayes had built from the ashes of betrayal. The lavender bushes in her front yard, which had once withered under the heat of neglect, were now blooming in thick, fragrant clusters of purple. The house itself looked younger. The peeling paint had been scraped away and replaced with a warm coat of cream, and the roof no longer groaned under the weight of the wind. But the biggest change was not in the architecture. It was in the woman who lived there. Margaret sat at a sleek oak desk, not in her kitchen but in a small office space downtown rented with a portion of the restitution money. On the frosted glass of the door, etched in simple, elegant letters, were the words, "The Open Ledger Foundation." Across from her sat an elderly man named Mr. Henderson. He was clutching a hat in his trembling hands, his eyes filled with the same confusion and shame Margaret had felt 12 months ago. He had just finished telling her how his nephew had convinced him to sign over the deed to his house. "Mr. Henderson," Margaret said softly, leaning forward. "Look at me." The man looked up. "You are not foolish," Margaret said, her voice firm and kind. "You are generous. Those are two different things. Your nephew used your love as a weapon. That is his crime, not your failure." She slid a folder across the desk. Inside were the business cards of Amelia Rowe and a financial planner who volunteered his time for the foundation. "We are going to help you get it back. It will be a fight, but you will not be fighting alone." The man began to weep silently. Margaret reached across the desk and held his hand just as she had held her son's hand on that rainy night. This was her life now. She had taken the $40,000 that Clara had stolen and returned, and she had turned it into a shield for others. She had realized that her story was not unique. There were thousands of Margarets out there, silent victims of financial abuse, hiding in the shadows of family loyalty. The door opened and David walked in. He looked different too. The gray shadows under his eyes were gone, replaced by a healthy vitality. He was no longer the harried executive too busy to notice the world around him. He was still a businessman, but he had reorganized his priorities. He visited the foundation twice a week, not just to sign checks, but to listen. He carried 2 coffees, one for himself and one for Mr. Henderson. "Here you go, sir," David said, placing the cup gently on the desk. "My mother prefers tea, but I thought you might need this." Mr. Henderson looked at the young man in the expensive suit serving him coffee. "Thank you, son," he whispered. David sat in the corner chair quietly taking notes. He had become the Foundation's fiercest advocate, using his corporate connections to raise funds for legal defense for the elderly. He often told Margaret that fighting for these strangers was the only way he could forgive himself for not fighting for her sooner. Later that evening, after the office had closed, Margaret and David walked to the nearby park. The twilight was soft and blue. "I heard from a mutual friend today," David said quietly. "About Clara." Margaret did not stop walking, but she tilted her head. "Oh, she is in Chicago," David said, "working as a receptionist at a car dealership, living in a small apartment. The friend said she looks older, tired." Margaret looked at the horizon where the city lights were beginning to twinkle. She felt no spike of satisfaction, no rush of vindication. The anger that had once fueled her investigation had long since burned itself out, leaving behind only a clean, empty space where peace now lived. "I hope she finds her way," Margaret said honestly. "I hope she learns that she does not need to steal to be enough." David looked at his mother with admiration. "You really have forgiven her, haven't you?" "I have released her," Margaret corrected. "Forgiveness suggests she asked for it. Release means I refuse to carry the weight of her sins anymore. I have too much work to do to be dragging a heavy suitcase of hate behind me." They reached the car. David opened the door for her. "By the way, Mom," David said, smiling. Amelia called. "The City Council wants to give you that award, the Citizen of the Year. They want you to speak at the gala next month." Margaret laughed, a light sound that bubbled up from her chest. "Oh dear, a gala. I do not have anything to wear." David grinned. "Well, I know a great personal shopper. Me. We are going shopping on Saturday. And this time, Mom, we are buying the dress you deserve, not the one on the clearance rack." The gala was a glittering affair held in the same ballroom where Clara had once dreamed of hosting her charity events, but this room was not filled with social climbers and pretenders. It was filled with people who had been helped by the Open Ledger Foundation. There were lawyers, social workers, and dozens of seniors who had reclaimed their dignity. When Margaret walked onto the stage, the applause was deafening. She wore a gown of deep navy blue silk, dignified and beautiful. She stood at the podium and waited for the room to quiet. She did not speak of her suffering. She did not mention Clara's name. "I was once asked," Margaret began, her voice projecting clear and strong to the back of the room, "what the most valuable currency in the world is. Some say it is gold, some say it is data. For a long time, I thought it was the $5,000 I needed to survive." She paused, looking down at David, who sat in the front row, his eyes shining with tears. "But I was wrong. The most valuable currency is truth. Truth is the only thing that cannot be counterfeited. It is the only thing that does not lose value over time. When we tell the truth about what is happening to our elders, when we shine a light on the shadows of financial abuse, we are not just saving bank accounts. We are saving souls. We are telling our mothers and fathers that they matter, that they are seen, that they are not forgotten." The ovation that followed was not polite. It was thunderous. It was the sound of a community waking up. That night, back in the quiet sanctuary of her home, Margaret sat by her window. The gala was over. The applause had faded. The dress was hung back in the closet. She was just Margaret again. She opened her old leather journal, the one that had witnessed her darkest hours and her fiercest battles. She turned to the final page. She picked up her pen and wrote slowly, the ink flowing smoothly onto the paper. "The journey is done. The debt is paid. The ledger is balanced. I am no longer the woman who waited for an envelope. I am the woman who opened the door." She closed the book and ran her hand over the worn cover. She stood up and walked to the mantelpiece where a photo of her late husband, Frank, stood. She lit a small candle beside it. The flame flickered, dancing in the gentle draft from the air conditioner. She thought of Frank. She thought of the boy David had been and the man he had become. She thought of the lavender blooming in the dark outside. Margaret Hayes smiled. It was not a smile for the cameras or for her son. It was a smile for herself. She turned off the lamp, plunging the room into a soft, comforting darkness, illuminated only by the single candle. She whispered into the silence a final benediction for the past and a welcome for the future. The truth always finds its way home. And so finally have I. Margaret blew out the candle. The smoke curled up a thin gray ribbon rising toward the ceiling, carrying with it the last vestiges of the story. The house was quiet. The heart was full. And tomorrow there was work to do.